Good evening, and welcome to tonight's lecture. Last week I was warned by several people that Dawn Gilpin, member of the lecture organization committee, was going to ask me to introduce tonight's speaker. I was hesitant to accept because I don't know Ms. Fishman and was a little reluctant to speak about or introduce someone that I had a little knowledge of. I knew, however, that she's been and is involved in a body of work called Hybrids, which is also the title of tonight's lecture, and that she's the head of the painting department and the artist in residence at the Cranbrook Academy of Art. And perhaps for these reasons, particularly being a teacher at Cranbrook, I felt a certain small kinship or distant relation to. Cranbrook, as many of you already know, represents a great tradition in American art and design education, one that I've often felt that we here at SCI-Arc are partially heir to. From the early years of Eliel Saarinen and his idea of a community of individuals, through the years of Charles Eames, Ray Kaiser Eames, Harry Bertoya, and Florence Knoll, to the recent tenors in the architecture department of Danielle Liebeskin and Dan Hoffman, Cranbrook has consistently maintained a position of influence in the art and design community. This influence, I believe, is due in large part to the artists and architects that have been or are currently teaching there. Beverly Fishman is a part of this illustrious tradition. In this sense, the practitioner architect or working artist who teaches, combined with an idea about education as an ongoing experiment or creative endeavor, is something that the two schools, Cranbrook and SCI-Arc, share. It's from within this context that I would like to welcome to SCI-Arc and introduce to you Beverly Fishman.
Okay, can you hear me? Everything fine? I'd like to read a short Webster's Dictionary 1938 description of hybrids. Hybrids may show various combinations of the characters of the two parents or exhibit new characters or reversions to ancestral ones. Sometimes they resemble one parent but contain in a latent condition characters of the other. My history comes out of 70s feminist work. I don't really yet have a connection to the history of Cranbrook. I was left, and I mentioned this already to a couple people, George Ortman was head of painting for 23 years at Cranbrook. When I walked into the position a couple years ago, I felt like I was starting over. He didn't leave me with much, which I think is quite interesting. Okay, this is my 1980 Yale thesis show, which is my graduate work. It's important work for my development because this work was shown in galleries and museums after graduating. And I point that out only because I teach on the graduate level, and I'm very conscious about, for my students, thinking about the work in terms of a serious, important piece in their development. But Ree Morton, who was a 70s feminist artist, is who really influenced me, and that was in undergraduate school at Philadelphia College of Art. I was there in 72, 73. I was about 18 years old. I'm 39 now. You don't have to figure it out for yourselves. I'll just tell you. Everybody likes to know those little things, especially about women. But in the 70s, she was steeped in feminism, and it was an incredible positive energy. And her interest, which became my interest in a lot of ways, were materials that were devalued by culture. And a lot of times they were theatrical materials and infusing high and low art. And so I came to Yale, which was an incredible tradition, unlike the tradition that I came out of in terms of Ree Morton's tradition. and came into the painting department and decided that I was going to deal with painting and sculpture and a combination of those two. These pieces are latex, wood, wire, plaster, and pigment. They use the wall as a backdrop, like theater or like drawing or painting. Everything that you see here in terms of building, I taught myself, so they were incredibly intuitive. I used dry pigments for their intensity. This was a particularly vermilion piece, which was a stop sign orange. This piece was latex with wire. They were incredibly whimsical and light, and you'll see as I developed the work, they became much heavier, more about the body and not the figure. And someone who's been an interest of mine is Barbara Stafford, and I want to read something that she's written about. The body is really more about phenomenal experience. It's more It's more experimental than the figure. The figure is a kind of abstraction. And I think that's something that happened to me, was a direct shift away from the figure into the ideas about the body. This is a mint green ballerina. It leans against the wall. I was very influenced by post-minimalism, work that used the wall, like Richard Serra Pratt pieces or Eva Hesse's pieces, and the issues between pictorial and sculptural. I thought that the post-minimalist work was open-ended and that there was a lot of room for development. So this piece from this particular spot is, for me, illusionistically flat. And then as you got closer, you realized that it was much more sculptural and extended off the wall about 4 feet. They were very hollow and fragile and weighed about a pound. This piece on the right, the black rubber piece, is a 3-dimensional piece. I was a terrible builder, and no one taught me how to build anything. And so I had to use bathroom rubber silicone to glue the feet to the floor so that these pieces wouldn't fall over. But from far away, this piece looked incredibly flat, but it was a 3-dimensional piece. There's every influence under the sun in this work. Gorky, Picasso, Elizabeth Murray, Judy Pfaff. I mean, you name it, this work had it in there. But what interests me was this little grouping of images that were I kept on my wall, and they were microscopic images. They were images that needed instrumentation or phototechnology to experience or see these things. And I think I was starting to think about these photos of tiny creatures, and that they were the so-called truth, and they lived in the world, and they were alive. And I wanted my work to somehow have that in the work. I was also already thinking about new techniques of scientific visualization. And I kept thinking that I've never seen these things before, but they're believable. I also had very little interest in straight painting at the time. A friend of mine, Debbie Mintz, who was a grad student with me, had worked with Robert Pincus Witten, who had written the post-minimal book in the 70s. And she came into my studio and told me that painting was dead the first week of graduate school. And they've been saying painting's dead for, since 18-something, since photography, since whatever. But it was at the right moment, exactly at the right time. And the first week of graduate school, I decided I was not going to be a painter and just developed the work. And so Debbie Mintz has a big role in that. There's a 3-year jump here, and I left graduate school hopefully to find my own voice. This work was excessive. I was interested in a body that was devalued in our culture. It was sensorial, it had a visual experience, it had a touch, it had a smell. My interest in the figure moved into the dark interior of the body. I wanted a sensory richness, a body that's not dry, a body with fluids, a wet body, especially with female openings. Now, these aren't exact bodies. They're body identification, so that when one would be in the presence of these, you would consider them another body, but they weren't literal. They were just associative. I also changed materials and started working with foam rubber, another material that was devalued by high art. I liked foam rubber because it had a kind of breathing quality. It was alive when you touched it. If you pushed it, it pushed back. It was like skin. I also liked it because it was incredibly light, and I could have huge rolls of it, and I could carve with it. And I purchased an electric kitchen knife and would carve, 6-7 foot pieces out of it. The thing that interests me the most about this work was how aggressive a piece could look and how physically fragile it actually was. And that was my personal psychology. In a review, the reviewer said these were like Frankenstein. They were hybrid monsters. When finished, they were already in ruins. That really interests me, to challenge the customary construction of the body's boundaries, to speak about the organs, to take what's private and interior and make it public. I was not out to disturb anyone or shock anyone. It was really my specific view and my relationship to medical science and medical books and things that I was looking at and reading about. And these were specifically taken from medical organ images. I started collecting medical books at this time, and I can't really tell if they're in focus. So from here, they look out of focus. Are they in focus? Okay. They're about 8 feet, and they come off the wall usually 3 to 4 feet. I used materials that deteriorated or dissolved or aged and became brittle with time, like the body. I also was using the idea of magnification, and so that a lot of these organ pieces, although they weren't literal, were organs, and they were only seen through technology and through the lens, so that by blowing up an organ, taking it out of context and blowing it up, that became a very important idea for me, that kind of fragmentation. Now, what happened was these pieces were shown in Connecticut, and they were then to be shown in New York City at a gallery, and I brought them to the gallery, and they tore and they fell apart at the gallery. And I had not thought about the market when I made these pieces. There was no interest in this work for me in terms of thinking about them as commodities. But being there at the gallery and the gallery owner freaking out in front of me saying, what are we going to do with these things? And I suggested that I go get some stuff from Canal Street and just clump it on and no one would know the difference. And what was the big deal? The thing that shocked me was this was the 80s, not the 70s. In the 80s was, the commodity. And no one wanted something that was falling apart. And it actually upset me quite a bit because I had worked so hard on this work. And the psychology of the work was really important to me, but I also had a tremendous ego, and I wanted these pieces around at least in New York, and at least get them shown in New York, and not have them taken out of the gallery because they're falling apart. So I started to think about how I was going to keep this species alive, and I decided to shift the work to a metal chicken wire armature. And create the pieces in 2 or 3 parts. They became more complicated structurally, more durable if the species needed to survive, and that was very questionable in my mind, and I'm sure to many other people. But they were hard, and they became like a pure skin. And they extended off the wall. And I think these pieces even insulted the viewer more. And they didn't ingratiate themselves to the viewer. And I was really questioning this whole idea of the body and issues of beauty and taste. I wanted to show the body in pain to expose an experience of fragmentation. I wasn't interested in the perfect body. Perfect bodies don't suffer. I also was very influenced, and for many, many years, by medical science. Medical science and myself have had a really deep personal connection, and medical science had assumed the position of power over the body. And I was very much reacting to that. That's a close-up of how much painting you can put on a piece. When is enough enough? I still don't know that answer, when is enough enough. My students, I had a crit last week, and we were talking about ecstasy and sexuality, and I was saying how the piece in this painting needed to be more orgasmic, and they wanted me to explain what I meant by that. And it's that edge between when is something enough, or a kind of excessive stance, the opposite of the reduced. And at that time, this kind of painting, like 5,000 colors, that's about 6 inches of the piece, that was sort of enough for me at the time. And now I've really shifted, and it must be because I'm older and more mature. That's the only reason why I could think. Or I just got tired, you know? You can only be that emotional maybe through your 20s into your early 30s, and your body starts to break down and it can't take it, you know? So, I don't know, you'll have to decide. I just throw these things out there and, take what you will and leave the rest. Anyway, this was an interesting show for me because a viewer said to me that they smelled rotting flesh. And I thought that was the highest compliment one could give my work, because I thought these are inanimate objects and you smell something. And smell's a fundamental medium, being an attraction to other bodies. And I thought if you could give the viewer something so visceral or so real or so alive that you could take an inanimate object and have all the other bodily senses alive and involved with the looking and experiencing of the work, that was a success. And I still think that's an incredible success. And that goes against this whole trend in thinking about the body and the split between the mind and the body and the devaluing of our senses in the culture. These are all organ-related, umbilical cords, placentas. In 1985, I started drawing. Leaving the edge of the body, that being sculpture, I became my own scientist. I had the specimens, which I had already made, and I had already invented, which were like nature, which were like myself, and I decided to x-ray them or imagine what their interiors would be. I also started reusing my sculpture in a new way, and so it became generations and generations of art making from these sources, these older sources. And it was a way of inventing, I built these sculptures and I had a body of work, and then I was going to take from that body of work and make drawings. I ended up photographing both the drawings and the sculptures and then Xeroxing them and using them back into the work. So this is years of process of these parent pieces that came down through generations using these. And what happened was I became less interested in sculpture. I started making the sculptures only with the idea that I was going to make the drawings. And the drawings became 4 by 8 feet. And I was interested in a reality that was multi-layered. I felt the sculpture was incredibly dense, and that I think what started to happen for myself in a psychological way or an emotional way or an intuitive way, that I was becoming less and less interested in making these physical objects, and I was more interested in space, the idea of space. This is a little 3 feet amputated torso. This is a piece that a friend of mine who was an infectious disease specialist bought. Very few people bought these pieces. It was very depressing because I spent years paying to keep these pieces around, and this summer I threw half of them out, and it was a thrill because I thought after a while, what am I going to do with these things, you know? My whole life I worked to pay to house these things. And so I had at Yale, I had made friends with doctors, the people in the medical profession at Yale that were in the medical school. They became friends over the past 15 years. And I was very interested in a visual equivalent for how I could discuss or talk about or question the existence of ourselves as humans. And also I'm still very good friends with a researcher who deals with lupus and madness and became a psychiatrist, and then after she was a psychiatrist, she became, 3 other specialties, and she just went on and on and on. And I thought that's the way artists are. I mean, they don't stop, they don't become one thing, they develop and they change. But what was interesting to me about the piece that Chris bought is that he said he wasn't sure he could live with this piece because it was much too much like his life, which again I took this as very real and very important. I had a response to the medical profession and its desire or its ability to fragment the body and to see us as a piece. And I was really attempting to move away from that, meaning that was, I thought, for myself, a very dark position to have. And it wasn't just from a critical distance position, because when you have this incredible distance, it's very easy to critique something, and it was much too close to me. So I was making these drawings, and people were showing these drawings, but I ran into the same problems that I ran into with the sculpture. They were too big. I seemed to have problems in this way. The sculptures became much more amputated, much harsher. The holes, the wounds were bigger and deeper, and they were redder. And what you don't really see from the slides is how wet and dry all the sculpture is. So it's either very thickly polyurethaned or it's dripping with latex, which is like a rubber or skin. And so that there's areas that are incredibly shiny and wet and other areas that are dry. So then they're in all different periods of deterioration. The drawings, although I would say if you just saw this work, you might not see these things in the work. My work has never really been about an illustration of an idea. These are just things I think about. And I think about them all the time, and I become obsessed with them. But then how they become visual in the work, I've always felt with my work that it's open to interpretation. And I was looking at medical imagery and how it shows information. So there was usually a left side and a right side in how a lot of the imagery was represented. There was usually an exterior and an interior. And so I was setting up the drawings in the same way. I started looking at a lot of particle physics books, and I was thinking about the interior of the body as vast and unknown, not static like the sculpture. This is the last sculpture I made. What a thrill. And that's a close-up. I threw this one out this summer. And so that's the exterior and interior in terms of the drawing. One more. Now, what happened in '88 was I bought a Xerox machine with my, what do I call him now, my ex-person. You know, I had this worked out. I was going to be incredibly cool, very unemotional about it, right? I get to this point, I don't mention his name, and here I am. Anyway, Michael, we... 20 years since we were teens. Anyway, we were interested, both of us were interested in the Xerox machine. And I was tired of making sculptures, and it wasn't a seamless transition. In the studio, it was almost unbearable. I was collecting medical books, I was photographing my sculpture as specimens, and my sculptures as specimens, as photographs, became more interesting to me than the actual sculptures. And I would say it was called a crisis. I didn't know where I was going with any of these thoughts. I liked the Xerox machine. It was generative and reproductive. I more than humanized the machine, I feminized the machine. It did everything I did. It listened to me. It was an extension of myself. It enhanced my power. It did it immediately. It was like a good husband or wife. It did it fast. You know, it had all these incredible properties that humans didn't have, or humans I didn't know. Had I been a photographer, not a painter, I would have responded to this machine differently, and I'm well aware of that. And I came to it from a particular mindset, and I really did just see it as a tool, like a palette. It was a basic, very basic black and white machine. And I thought it gave me a rapid-fire image, which is a joke now. But I had photographed the drawings, and this piece before, let me just go back, is that yellow and black drawing. And it was also the sculpture from before. And so I was photographing everything and then manipulating it further. And it was opening up a lot of possibilities. These were very small pieces. They were about 12 by 24 inches. The Xerox of the photograph of the sculpture is on the left, so it's an exterior and interior view. And the sculpture's in the middle, and the right and left. I saw the sculpture as referring to myself or my body, and the images on the right and left are cellular and interior. I was also interested in tracking my thinking about beauty at this point and thinking about not wanting to make really repulsive, ugly work. And I wanted to do like the opposite. I wanted to seduce the viewer. Why? I don't know. Because I got tired, I think, really. Also, in this studio, there were 5 pieces of sculpture which were down to the chicken wire. And I kept looking at these medical books and science books. And I was not interested in making sculpture anymore. And what was very ironic is that in the couple years, the 2 years before, I didn't want to make sculpture anymore. People were interested in the sculpture and wanted to show the sculpture. And so I was torn because I didn't want to do it anymore, but I wanted the work seen. And I just sat in my studio. I left New York. I went back to Connecticut and sat in the studio and just had a crisis. And I sat there for about a year, and no one saw the work, and I just made these little collages, and I thought about DNA being the fundamental molecule of life, and that DNA could arrange itself in endless variations and form patterns. And I just started thinking about these things, but I didn't know where I was going to go with it. I wanted a fused, multi-layered image that was moving and changing. And the shape on the right is an actual image of a sculpture and moving through this piece, and it's about 18 inches by 8 feet. And I started using DNA to break up the actual physical body. I thought of these as meditations on genetics, identity, language, mortality. The images were distanced enough for me to work with them. Now, at the same time, in Connecticut, and I've jumped ahead to these particular pieces, I had a huge fire that I was in my house. Lucky that I got out alive. And I lost about 30 of the sculptures, and they were all the sculptures at the time that I was photographing. And so I've jumped ahead to these couple pieces. But I thought about Darwinian theory, how the strong survive. I was stopped completely in my tracks, and it was a kind of break in a process of thinking that comes up sometimes for artists. It seems like artists end up working and living in spaces that are undesirable in some way, and they end up, losing a lot of work. I've had so many friends lose a lot of work, but I looked at it as very positive, and I shifted the work to body images like this skeleton, and I used them as the surrogate self. This is a 9-inch by 12-inch piece, little organ piece. Then the work shifted once again to 7-foot module units, this piece called The Inherited Message. Now, I know that there's been a lot of work done about the Xerox machine or about the copy. I was thinking about the copy as more of a genetic connection. I was thinking about ideas of genetic engineering, cloning, cells splitting, reproducing, and mutating. I think a really interesting book for me is The Human Body Shop on genetic engineering and the ethical questions as well as the legal questions surrounding genetic engineering. And I'm very interested in all that, but I'm not interested in making work that specifically addresses it or illustrates it. There's been no other technology in history like the genetic engineering. Scientists have become capable of reprogramming the genetic codes of living things to suit our society's social and economic needs. This newfound ability to manipulate and engineer the genes of living organisms, we assume a new role in the natural scheme. For the first time in history, we have the potential for becoming the architects of life itself, the co-directors of evolution. I sort of saw myself in direct connection to that. I also was interested in this, this technology because it had only been around for about 30 years, and I thought I could expand the definition of painting. The fact that it didn't have a long history was very important for my own development. And that's a close-up. Thousands and hundreds of these little balls that were black and white Xerox that I hand-painted in an obsessive-compulsive way. Again, that split between, or that magnification, something that I was, again, very interested in is the body and how we saw the body. This was a very short phase in my life. This particular group of work was about 5 months. This piece is titled Hazel Eyes, and there's a molecular structure down the middle of it, and there's hundreds of different shades of hazel eyes. My mother used to say, if you had brown eyes, you'd be average. And you don't have blue eyes, you have hazel eyes. They're mysterious. On the other side of this, genetic engineering, how society will use genetic engineering for cosmetic purposes in a way that will foster certain forms of discrimination, is very interesting to me. But I consider this piece incredibly poetic, and one could contemplate that idea if one chose to. And these were these little orbs, and there were hundreds of hand-painted shades of hazel eyes. I also want to say that in terms of my use of the Xerox machine at this point, and I continue to think this way, is that I was interested in and I've always been in the unique, in the aura of the unique, the one of a kind, the quality or experience of the handmade with the machine. The work shifts here a bit, and again, a lot of the shifts, or many of the shifts in my work have to do with personal things that happen in my life, or are happening, or happened. In '90, this piece is called The Poetics of Disease. I shifted in this piece to laser technology, which is more photographic, and I thought it was a much harsher reality. And I'd like to read something that Roberta McGrath wrote. Scientific photography assumed the position of being merely a reflex of the real, and there was a general move to replace other means of visual record with the photography. This reality was limited to the exterior of the body because early emulsions were insensitive to red. Unlike most photographs which provide us with the familiar and known, they impinge on and break the fragile base upon which our lives are built, the disavowal of mortality, of disfiguration, a breakdown of barriers between the internal and exterior and external. At this point in New York, I had several friends that all were colliding and dying at the same time. I had a really hard time with that. I'm sure all of us have had to deal with the issue of AIDS. I think, you know, a lot of you are even younger and you're having to deal with it in your 20s and not be in your 30s and have to deal with it. I had a group of friends that I had known over a very long period of time, and they were dying one after the other. And I could not even go into the studio. If I didn't deal with this in some way, there was no way I could work. And so, again, these aren't illustrations of that, but that I started to use actual diseased images and think about that, and think about this piece called Body Memory, and the split in terms of this piece, or the formal cut in the work, that the panels in this piece are irregular, and they're speaking a lot about the actual body. A detail. Scarlet fever. These are about 7 feet or 8 feet by 4 feet, and the panels are modules, and the idea of things, the module unit, I used module units at this point, formal ways to speak about what the cell did. So if the cell split or mutated or divided, then I did those things formally. So I used the biological properties of cells to talk about the formal issues. This is sleeping sickness. And this is just a monster piece to me. Black virus. I thought it was also interesting how subversive abstract painting could be. I mean, I was responding in New York to all this abstract painting that had no content, and I thought if I could make these and I was thinking more, and that's why in certain ways I took the organs out of the work, because I thought that the work could be possibly more expressive or be more multidimensional or be a little bit more ambiguous and speak about more things. But I was looking at a lot of abstract painting, and I was thinking about what I thought it lacked. And it lacked, for me, any connection to the world. And so I wanted these to be paintings, and I wanted them to speak about painting and also speak about the world. This is red virus. These were generic viruses. These weren't specific viruses. And that's a close-up, and that's a detail of the center of that piece. These were hundreds and hundreds of pieces of collage. I mean, any of you who know, laser copy or Xerox copy, it's an 8.5 by 11 inch or 11 by 17 inch piece of paper. When you're working 8 feet and you're working on in a complex way, you're collaging, and I really wanted a seamless collage. And so I figured out ways to somehow get a seamless, what I thought was a seamless collage. And this is one of the first pieces at Cranbrook that represents about 6 months of work, and we need to change projectors now. I mean, we need to change carousels, sorry. We're going to come up to my newest body of work, which has been the last 2 years at Cranbrook. There was a shift in the work away from the rectangle. I wanted to reference the lens, the way that we saw this image. The roundish forms make reference to the human eye, to visual perception, and more specifically to the curved lens in the view under a microscope, the earlier technology that allowed a closer inspection of the body. These are 8 feet by 4 feet. It seemed to me that I started with the outside of the body and kept peeling away layer by layer like a philosopher, a psychologist, or a crazy person, trying to find out who we are. It seemed to me that the symbol of the self lies within the body. The question became physical. The cell is a biological structure, part of the human figure, but it is an abstract form, one coded like an abstract painting, with information that determines much about the body. The cell addresses the body without representing it. And these are module units of very small circle pieces that clearly reference the microscope or the telescope or the way in which we initially view the cell. These are close-ups. These are 12 inches and 18 inches. There's definitely a shift in this work away from what I think of in terms of ugly or a kind of fragmentation. I started to think that the ugly had become a mode that if it was ugly, it was serious, or it was a sign of some serious discourse. And I did not think about it that way anymore. I wanted the beautiful. I thought I didn't need to throw out the beautiful or the aesthetic anymore, just to point out that art always has an agenda or a point of view. This is a 2-foot by 8-foot ellipse, and the middle image is an exterior laser copy image of skin. And so it's actual skin, and the sides are cellular. So again, it's interior, exterior. This is a show I had last year at Suzanne Hilbery Gallery. And I run across the same questions about durability now. If I had to say the last 15 years of work, what's the thread of the question? Will this last more than 5 minutes? Because it's laser copy, because is it archival, la-di-da. You call these guys up, and when you talk to the laser copy people, they tell you it's archival, but they don't really know if it's archival. That's what I truly believe. But I say it's archival. You know why? Because I use an archival paper, and I then paint them. The new work uses cells and cellular structures. The language is based on the cell's ability to divide, mutate, and regenerate, and I build on this theme throughout. These are very hard to see, and I apologize for that. They're taken from 4x5s and then made into slides. This is a 2-foot by 12-foot piece, and it's mainly laser copy. And I started to get this, what I thought was incredible color out of the laser copier. And any of you have ever used the laser copier, I had Cranbrook buy a laser copier for me in order to take the job. People told me that when you're wheeling and dealing, when you first take a job, you better get what you want in the beginning, because once you take the job, it's all over. And I thought, hey, you know, why not? It was only a $30,000 piece of equipment. And I thought, I'm coming from New York to Detroit. That's the least they could do. And I also thought, because I am an East Coast snob, as you know, and I'm proud of it, that this would probably be the most used piece of equipment at Cranbrook. And I knew the designers would use it, I knew the architects would use it, I knew the photo people would use it, I knew the printmakers would use it. And they make money off this machine now. This machine is the most used piece of equipment in the entire school, and they can't believe that they lived without it. Now we're trying to get the fiery and the whole, you know, we're trying to move into the 20th century in terms of technology. But what I found on my own with the laser copier, and I don't know if you have one here, is that usually to work on the laser, I've been known to, in very subtle ways, to set off chain reactions at schools. And it's only about 30,000, so I don't see why you just can't get one tomorrow. But I had worked in New York with the laser copy, and you go to the shop and you hand them an image, and they tell you you can't get an electric blue, and you can't get a mint green, and you can't get these colors. And what I found by having the machine at the school, and that's what most of the students have found, working with it one-on-one, it can do anything that your mind wants it to do. And so it has a limitation of 4 colors, you know, the yellow, the pink, the cyan, and the black. And I was able to get this incredibly rich, which I think is incredibly rich, physical, sensual color out of this copier machine. And I did a lot of experimentation. It really changed, for me, my work. And I think it's the difference between how we've used those machines and how they were first used, in terms of having to pre-plan everything and go to some copy shop versus the hands-on experimentation. And so I think for me, it's really shifted my work. The diptych, this is 1 foot by 8 foot, this module unit, and it became an incredibly important shape for me. I think for me, it dealt with the idea of motion, it dealt with an object, it used the white wall, it did a lot of the things that my early sculpture did in terms of a sculptural shape and how it used the wall instead of just sitting on the wall like a painting. These just stacked so that they were movable and removable, and I could shift and change. And in this piece, there's a woodcut image as well as technology, so I'm moving back and forth in terms of the handmade and the machine-made. And at the same time, there was a show at the Cranbrook Museum, and this is that show. And this is an 8 by 8 foot piece, too. These are my twins. On the right side, there's much more painting. On the left side, it's a reversal image. It does not match up. I mean, everything is always off, and it's off purposefully. This is my Miami Vice piece. It's so shocking because the people who bought this piece shipped it to Florida. I couldn't believe it. It was a joke. I always thought it was Miami Vice. It was more science fiction to me. And again, I was looking more at the internal body structure and how it really did relate to all the other structures in the universe. And I was thinking in a much more positive way. And I think there's been a real change in myself, I have to say, about thinking about the kind of work that I'm producing and where the orientation of the work is. This is 2 feet by 16 feet, and it's hard to see because a 16-foot ellipse that hovers on the wall, it's sort of like with a lemon yellow and black buzz. It's eye-popping. A lot of the yellow and black is very like a hallucination. And that electric blue line is a single organ stretched. Another one of the 1x8s, the diptychs, the 2x8s. This piece was a simple experiment for me. It's each panel is about 20 inches by 12 feet, so they stack. So it's about, I don't know, almost 5 feet by 12 feet. And it was about taking a single image, and the middle image, this whole image is skin. It's just a single image of skin. Throughout this last body of work, I've collected many, many medical books, but I take very few images out of those medical books, and I manipulate them, continually manipulate them. And so this is an image that you've seen before, but you're seeing it in a different way now. And I just cloned the same image over and over again, and then hand-made it so that it had, each panel had a unique quality. This is an 8-foot by 1-foot piece, and I was thinking a lot about issues of painting. I was thinking a little bit about Barnett Newman, very little, but a little bit, about how thin a painting could be, and could it hold a wall, meaning could it have a tension and an intensity, being like a single strip or a blip or something. I've actually gone thinner, and I'm working on pieces that are about 6 inches. And I've changed the format. That's a really dark, dark green piece. And then I'm just going to show you the last couple pieces that I've been working on. In this particular image, I think what's interesting for me is I've taken some really basic ideas, the human cell, what the cell does, and the human cell has endless variations. And I use the copier to copy them. And so that I take this basic idea and I manipulate it. And so I have endless variety, endless color, and endless variation. And I never have to worry anymore about what my images are going to be, because it just seems endless. As soon as I take an image, I can use it in so many different ways. And the actual laser copier can distort it in so many different ways that I have found that I don't have to worry about being creative anymore. You know how painters worry about that. Even if they don't talk about it, they do. And they also worry about being unique. And I don't worry about that anymore. Also, what's going on in this piece, it's a 15-inch, each ellipse is 15 inches wide by 30 inches, is I'm now putting a very thick polyurethane resin over the pieces. And so all the pieces now that I'm working on refer very consciously to the lens, to the actual lens. And it's a very physical kind of thick, ultra-clear resin, and it's not flat. It's more sculptural. And it's a shame you don't really pick up on that. And also this interest for me between painting and technology, and sometimes the pieces are incredibly painted and the technology is way, way underneath the piece, and sometimes there's hardly any painting. And so I've just set up these limitations and I work within them. And the last dark slide. And that's it. Thank you. I'd be happy to attempt to answer a couple questions. Are you people just like Cranbrook people? I always warn the visitors, don't be offended when no one asks a question. And at the end, they always say, God, they were so polite, they didn't ask anything. I said, no, they're scared to death. It's not polite. Nothing? Well, that's a breeze. Thank you.